Born with the blood of kings and a place 25th in line to the throne, Lady Marina Windsor possessed a birthright that history has killed for. She didn't abdicate for a scandalous romance like Edward VIII, nor did she flee for a Netflix deal like Prince Harry. Instead, she walked into a cathedral, knelt in silence, and voluntarily erased herself from the line of succession. She traded her crown not for money, fame, or love, but for the one thing the British monarchy has historically feared most: her faith. This is the story of the only Windsor who dared to become a ghost. While her sister, Lady Amelia, was anointed the most beautiful royal and became a glamorous brand ambassador, Marina chose the library over the catwalk and anonymity over the spotlight. It is the haunting portrait of a woman who realized that the only way to survive the crushing, gilded cage of royal duty was not to decorate it, but to dissolve the bars entirely. This is the untold story of the girl who looked at ultimate power and politely, devastatingly said no. To measure the true cost of Marina Windsor's life, one must first confront the invisible electric fence that surrounds the British monarchy. It is not made of iron or stone, but of ink and parchment. It is called the Act of Settlement of 1701. In the modern world, where the British monarchy presents itself as a benign, multicultural, and inclusive institution, the Act of Settlement is a jarring medieval anomaly. It is the iron law that dictates the succession to the throne, and it was forged in the fires of religious hatred. Passed by Parliament over 300 years ago, its primary singular purpose was not just to ensure a Protestant succession, but to explicitly, aggressively, and permanently ban Roman Catholics from the throne. The British state did eventually realize how medieval its own wiring looked. In 2013, Parliament passed the Succession to the Crown Act, finally scrapping the rule that a royal who married a Catholic would be automatically cut out of the line of succession. When the law came into force in 2015, Marina's father, the Earl of St. Andrews, quietly slipped back into the line after almost 3 decades in exile, purely because he had never changed his own religion. But the core taboo remained untouched. The Act of Settlement's ban on a Catholic sovereign was left standing. The gate was reopened for spouses, not for souls. Marina and Edward, who had crossed the line themselves, stayed outside. Their exclusion was no longer a historical quirk of an old marriage law. It was a deliberate, modern decision to keep their kind of faith permanently on the far side of the fence. The language of the act is not subtle. It declares that anyone who holds communion with the See or Church of Rome or shall marry a papist is naturally dead in the eyes of the law regarding the succession. For 3 centuries, this has been the third rail of royal politics. To be a Catholic is to be an outsider. To convert to Catholicism is to commit constitutional suicide. It is the ultimate rejection of the monarch's role as the defender of the faith. For most of the royal family, this is an abstract piece of history. But for the Kents, Marina's family, it is a lived reality. It is a shadow that hangs over their dinner table. It is the mechanism that has defined their lives, their marriages, and their identities for 3 generations. Marina Windsor was born into a crossfire. On one side was the rigid Protestant duty of the monarchy. On the other was the pull of the old faith, the Catholicism that her family seemed inextricably drawn to, like moths to a dangerous flame. She was not just born into a royal house. She was born into a theological war zone. The first pillar of Marina's world is her grandfather, Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent. To look at him is to see the perfect Platonic ideal of the minor royal. He is the Queen's first cousin. For over 80 years, he has been the silent, stoic, and utterly reliable scenery of the House of Windsor. He's the man standing on the balcony at Buckingham Palace, face impassive, uniform crisp, waving mechanically. He is the man handing out the trophies at Wimbledon year after year, decade after decade, his politeness acting as a suit of armor. His life was forged in tragedy. His father, the glamorous and scandalous Prince George, Duke of Kent, was killed in a plane crash in 1942 when Edward was just a boy. From that moment, Edward's life became a reaction to that chaos. He became the robot royal. He dedicated his existence to erasing his own personality. He became a vessel of duty. He did not speak out of turn. He did not have scandals. He did not have opinions. He simply was. He built the Kent model of survival. You survive by disappearing into the role. You become the uniform. You become the handshake. You become the plaque unveiling. It is a life of profound grinding boredom, sustained by a sense of obligation that borders on masochism. This was the thesis of Marina's inheritance. Be silent, be dutiful, be Protestant, be invisible. But every thesis demands an antithesis, and the antithesis was waiting at home. If the Duke of Kent was the architect of the cage, his wife, Catherine Worsley, the Duchess of Kent, was the woman who found the key. Catherine is the most important figure in understanding Marina's soul. She is the patient zero of the Kent Rebellion. Catherine married the Duke in 1961 with all the fanfare of a state wedding. She was beautiful, musical, and deeply sensitive. She tried for years to play the role. She wore the hats. She smiled at the garden parties. She accepted the bouquets from terrified children. She became Her Royal Highness. But the machine broke her. The emptiness of the role, the sheer crushing lack of humanity in the daily routine of a minor royal began to erode her spirit. In the 1970s, she suffered from severe depression. She had a tragic stillbirth, a trauma that was compounded by the cold, stiff upper lip expectations of the royal household. She was a woman of deep feeling trapped in an institution that viewed feelings as a weakness. Catherine cracked, but she didn't crack like Diana. She didn't go to the press. She didn't throw herself down the stairs or record secret tapes. She went inward. She began to retreat. She realized that the royal identity was a costume and a suffocating one at that. So she began to strip it off. She famously stopped using the HRH style in her private life, asking people to simply call her Catherine. Then she did something that was, in the context of her class and position, revolutionary. She got a job, not a patronage, not a role as a figurehead, a job. For over a decade, the Duchess of Kent worked as a music teacher at a state primary school in Hull, a working-class city in the north of England. She didn't arrive in a limousine. She didn't bring a security detail that hovered in the classroom. She was Mrs. Kent, the piano teacher. Most of her students and many of their parents had absolutely no idea that the woman teaching them scales was a member of the royal family. This was the first lesson Marina would inherit. Your value does not come from your title. It comes from what you can do. But the final act of Catherine's rebellion was the most profound. In 1994, when Marina was just a toddler, the Duchess of Kent did the unthinkable. She converted to Roman Catholicism. It was a constitutional earthquake. It was the first time in modern history that a senior member of the royal family had publicly defected from the Church of England. It was a rejection of the Act of Settlement. It was a rejection of the state religion. It was a declaration that her soul was her own, and that no act of parliament, no royal protocol, could dictate her relationship with God. By the time Marina was old enough to understand the rules of the game, the real fault line in the Kent family had already opened. In 1994, her grandmother Catherine did the unthinkable and was received into the Catholic Church, the first senior royal to cross that line in modern times. 7 years later, the youngest Kent's son, Lord Nicholas, followed her, forfeiting his own place in the succession. In 2003, when Marina was 10, her brother Edward, Lord Downpatrick, chose the same path at 15. One by one, the family's most interior, serious souls were stepping off the conveyor belt of Anglican conformity and into a prescribed faith. When Marina finally moved in 2008, she was not an isolated teenage rebel. She was the fourth movement in a long, slow Kent symphony of conscience. The Queen, in her infinite pragmatism, gave her permission. But the message was clear. The Kents were different. They were the spiritual outliers. They were the ones who prioritized the internal over the external. This schism between the Duke's duty and the Duchess's faith was the atmosphere of Marina's childhood home. Her father, George Windsor, Earl of St. Andrews, was the eldest son of this complex couple, and he too made his choice early. He was a bookish, quiet man, educated at Eton and Cambridge. He was a diplomat, not a soldier, and he followed his mother's path. He married Silvana Tomaselli. Silvana is not a typical royal spouse. She is a formidable intellectual. Born in Canada, she is a historian and academic at Cambridge University, specializing in 18th century political theory, the Enlightenment, and the works of Mary Wollstonecraft. She is also a devout Roman Catholic. By marrying her in 1988, George Windsor automatically forfeited his place in the line of succession under the Act of Settlement. He was kicked out. This meant that Marina Windsor was born into a household that had already been punished for its faith. She was born into a home filled with books, not horses. Dinner table conversations were not about polo matches or grouse shooting. They were about political philosophy, history, and theology. While her cousins, William and Harry, were growing up in the glare of the paparazzi, dealing with the catastrophic fallout of Charles and Diana's marriage, Marina and her siblings, Edward and Amelia, were growing up in a strange, quiet, intellectual silo within Kensington Palace. They were technically royals. They lived in the palace. They appeared on the balcony, but they were culturally distinct. They were the Catholic intellectuals in a family of Protestant managers. Lady Marina Charlotte, Alexandra Catherine Helen Windsor, was born on September the 30th, 1992, at the Rosie Hospital in Cambridge. Long before she ever stepped into a Catholic cathedral, Marina had already been carried to the font of England's state religion. On 21st January 1993, in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace, she was christened into the Church of England by the subdean, surrounded by a neat list of godparents with impeccable surnames. On paper, nothing about this baby suggested rebellion. She began life exactly as the system intended, a Windsor child formally inscribed into Anglicanism, spiritually wired into the very constitution she would one day quietly unplug herself from. Note the year, 1992. This was the Queen's Annus Horribilis. It was the year the monarchy seemed to be falling apart. Windsor Castle burned down. Charles and Diana separated. Sarah Ferguson was caught in scandal. The institution was in flames. But in Cambridge, far away from the tabloids, Marina was born into the quiet side of the family. She was named Marina after her great-grandmother, the glamorous Princess Marina of Greece, the widow of the tragic Prince George. It was a name heavy with history, a name that evoked European elegance and tragedy. From the beginning, Marina was different from her younger sister, Amelia. Amelia, born 3 years later, had a sparkle. She had the it factor. She drew the eye. Marina was the observer. She was the middle child. Her older brother Edward was the heir, the future Duke of Kent. Amelia was the baby, the beauty. Marina occupied the liminal space in between. She was sent to St. Mary's Ascot for her education. This detail is crucial. St. Mary's is a top-tier boarding school, yes, but it is a Catholic school. It is run by the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary. At St. Mary's Ascot, the paradox in her life took on a very ordinary uniform. On one level, she was exactly what a Catholic boarding school is supposed to produce for Britain's upper class. Bright, diligent, eventually deputy head girl in her final years. On another, she was already living somewhere, between the chapel and the wings of the school theater. St. Mary's gave her two habits that would never quite leave her: structured prayer and a taste for performance. Both followed her to Edinburgh. There, instead of building a social throne, she hid in the language library with French and Portuguese verbs, spent her evenings in student drama societies, and filed short, earnest pieces for a campus magazine. To her lecturers, she was just Marina, the quiet linguist in the corner. The royal surname was something she kept in her back pocket, not on her name tag. While at school, most royal teenagers are focused on social climbing, on meeting the right people, on preparing for their debut. Marina went inward. She absorbed the atmosphere of the place, the incense, the rituals, the quietude of the chapel. She saw the example of her grandmother, the Duchess, who had found peace not in the applause of the crowd, but in the silence of the Mass. She began to realize the central paradox of her existence. She was Lady Marina. She was 25th in line to the throne. The world told her that this was her identity. The world told her that she should care about precedence, about where she sat at dinner, about who she married. But her education and her grandmother's example told her something else. They told her that all of that was dust. They told her that the crown was temporary, but the soul was eternal. As she entered her teenage years, a time when Amelia was beginning to look at fashion magazines and dream of Paris, Marina was looking at the act of settlement. She was reading the fine print of her own life. She realized she was standing on a trap door. She was in the line of succession, but she didn't belong there. Her heart was with the old faith, the faith of her mother and grandmother. But the law said she couldn't have both. She couldn't be a royal heir and a Catholic. The system demanded she choose. And as 2008 approached, as she turned 15, Marina Windsor prepared to make the choice that would define the rest of her life. She prepared to do what so few people in history have ever done. She prepared to say no to power. In the long, turbulent history of the British monarchy, abdications are usually accompanied by national trauma. When King Edward VIII abdicated in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, it nearly broke the institution. It was a crisis played out in Parliament, on the radio, and in the terrified whispers of the establishment. It was a decision made for romantic love, a selfish act that thrust his stammering brother onto the throne and changed the course of history. But in 2008, another abdication took place. It happened without a radio address. It happened without a constitutional crisis. It happened in the quiet, incense-scented air of a Catholic cathedral. Lady Marina Windsor, age 15, knelt before a bishop. The moment the oil of chrism touched her forehead in the sacrament of confirmation, the invisible machinery of the British state clicked into gear. It was a metaphysical transaction with very real-world consequences. In the eyes of the church, she was being sealed with the Holy Spirit. In the eyes of the state, she was being deleted. The act of settlement is unforgiving. It does not care if you are a teenager. It does not care if you are devout. It operates on a binary switch, Protestant or Catholic. By confirming her faith, Marina was, legally and constitutionally, declaring herself naturally dead for the purposes of succession. She entered the cathedral as the 25th person in line to the throne of the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Canada, and Australia. She left the cathedral as a private citizen with a courtesy title. We must stop and consider the psychological magnitude of this choice for a teenager. At 15, most girls in her social circle, the glossy posse of aristocrats and heirs, were obsessed with status. They are fighting for invitations to the right parties, the right fashion shows, the right debutante balls. Status is the currency of their world. Marina took that currency and burned it. She did not do it because she hated her family. She did not do it as a punk rock rebellion against the queen. She did it because she realized that the royal identity was a hollow shell, while her spiritual identity was a solid core. She chose the eternal over the temporal. The press coverage was muted. A few paragraphs in the Daily Telegraph, a snippet in the Daily Mail noting that another Windsor defects. But within the walls of Kensington Palace, the silence was likely profound. It was the sound of another door closing. Her older brother, Edward, had already left. Now, Marina. The Kent branch of the family was slowly, quietly, turning off the lights on their royal heritage. With the constitutional shackles removed, Marina faced a new question. Who am I now? She answered it in the same way her parents would have with a book. She followed the well-trodden path of the upper classes to the University of Edinburgh. But her time there would become the perfect case study in the divergence between her and her younger sister Amelia, who would follow her there a few years later. Edinburgh University is a unique ecosystem. It is the playground of the posh elite who find Oxford too intense and London too crowded. It is a place where students wear Barber jackets, go shooting on weekends, and hold dinner parties that rival state banquets. It is a place where you go to see and be seen. When Lady Amelia arrived later, she conquered Edinburgh. She was the queen of the student fashion shows. She was the face of the social scene. She was photographed in the clubs on George Street. She was the it girl. Marina, by contrast, was the ghost of Edinburgh. She did not walk in the charity fashion shows. She did not appear in the society pages of the student newspaper. She studied French and Portuguese. She buried herself in the library. She lived a life of aggressive normalcy. Eyewitnesses from that time describe a girl who seemed almost allergic to her own surname. If you met her at a tutorial, she was just Marina. If you asked about her grandmother, the Duchess, she would politely deflect. She did not wear her title. She hid it. While Amelia was learning how to be a brand, Marina was learning how to be a person. She was immersing herself in foreign languages, literally learning to speak in a voice that wasn't English, wasn't royal, wasn't Windsor. Portuguese became her escape hatch. It was the language of Brazil, a country where the act of settlement was just a dusty piece of trivia, and where Lady Marina could disappear into the rhythm of a different culture. After graduating, the divergence between the sisters became absolute. By 2016, Amelia was on the cover of Tatler. She was signed to Storm Models. She was sitting front row at Dior. She was monetizing the Windsor name with a ruthlessness that was both impressive and terrifying. She was soaring into the stratosphere of high luxury. Marina went in the opposite direction. She went to the mud. She did not sign with a modeling agency. She did not get a job at an art gallery in Mayfair, the safe haven for aristocratic girls. She walked into the offices of the Big Give. After university, Marina did something vanishingly rare for a Windsor. She went into the wiring of charities instead of their photo ops. Her first serious posting was at the Big Give, a match funding platform that connects donors with small charities. From there, she didn't leap upwards into some glamorous patronage. She moved sideways into the engine room of an environmental charity, the Blue Marine Foundation. For international audiences, The Big Issue is a unique British institution, a street newspaper sold by people who are homeless or vulnerably housed, a hand-up. rather than a handout. Marina didn't join that frontline world directly. Instead, she went into the quieter wiring of modern philanthropy at the Big Give, a match funding platform that connects donors with small charities and doubles the money they raise. There, she wasn't a royal patron turning up for the cameras. She was a member of staff learning how grants are structured, how campaigns are written, and how impact is actually measured. Marina Windsor, the great-granddaughter of King George V, got a job there. And she didn't just lend her name to a gala dinner or become a patron. She worked there. She was part of the editorial team. She spent her days writing about social exclusion. She spent her time listening to the stories of men and women who had slept in doorways, who had lost everything, who were invisible to the society that Marina had been born to rule. The irony is blinding. It is Shakespearean. The girl born in a palace chose to spend her working life amplifying the voices of those with no home. She did not post about this on Instagram. There were no selfies with the homeless to prove her virtue. There were no interviews where she patted herself on the back. She simply did the work. This was the Catherine model of survival, perfected. Just as her grandmother, the Duchess of Kent, had driven to Hull to teach music to children who didn't know she was a royal highness. Marina was building a professional life where her value came from her output, not her bloodline. At the Big Give, nobody cares who your grandfather is. They care if you can hit a deadline. They care if you can tell a story with empathy. They care if you treat the vendors with respect. Marina thrived in this environment. She wrote articles about the transformative power of art for the marginalized. She wrote about the environment. She found a voice that was distinct, compassionate, and utterly removed from the royal rota of sanitized press releases. She had found the third path. She wasn't suffering in the cage of duty, and she wasn't selling the cage for parts. She had simply walked out of the zoo and got a job. Then came 2018, the year the royal family effectively broke in two. The wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle was billed as a modern fairy tale. It was a global spectacle watched by billions. It was meant to be the moment the monarchy embraced the future. But behind the scenes, the guest list was being drawn up with the cold precision of a corporate restructuring. The slimmed-down monarchy, the vision of the future King Charles, was being put into practice. The firm was shedding weight. When the invitations were sent out, the entire younger generation of Kents, Amelia, Marina, and Edward, were excluded. The snub made headlines. "The most beautiful royal left off the list," screamed the tabloids, referring to Amelia. It was framed as a humiliation. It was the establishment telling the influencers that they were not welcome. For Amelia, it was a professional blow. It undermined her brand. It said publicly, "You are not one of us." For a while, the system still behaved as if she belonged to it. In 2011, when the guest list for William and Catherine's wedding at Westminster Abbey was drawn up, Lady Marina's name was on it. She took her place in the pews with dozens of cousins, another well-dressed silhouette in the long shot as the cameras panned across the Abbey. 7 years later, when Harry married Meghan in Windsor, the picture had changed. None of the Kent grandchildren, not Edward, not Marina, not Amelia, were invited. For her sister, it was a professional bruise, a headline about being snubbed. For Marina, it felt like something colder and more structural, an early unspoken confirmation that the slimmed-down monarchy no longer had a chair for her, even at the back of the chapel. But for Marina, one suspects that when the invitation didn't arrive, Marina didn't weep. She didn't call her agent. She likely poured a cup of tea and exhaled. For Amelia, the wedding was a stage she was denied. For Marina, the wedding was a circus she was spared. being cut from the guest list was the final definitive confirmation of her freedom. It meant she didn't have to buy a hat. She didn't have to curate a look for the cameras. She didn't have to walk past the banks of screaming photographers and have her body language analyzed by the Daily Mail. She didn't have to sit in St. George's Chapel and pretend to be part of a system she had spiritually left 10 years earlier. The snub was a gift. It was the monarchy saying, "We don't own you anymore." On the day of the wedding, while the world obsessed over Meghan's dress and Harry's nervousness, while the cameras panned over the faces of the relevant royals, Marina was somewhere else. She was invisible. She was enjoying the one luxury that Harry and Meghan would spend the next 5 years desperately trying to buy, and failing: privacy. She had achieved what Prince Harry could not. He left the family but took the spotlight with him. He became a celebrity prince, trapped in a dialogue with his own fame. Marina had achieved true escape velocity. She was no longer a royal. She was just a woman. With the ties to the palace severed completely, Marina expanded her horizons. She moved from the Big Give to the Blue Marine Foundation, an ocean conservation charity. Again, note the contrast with the typical royal patronage. She wasn't turning up to cut a ribbon at an aquarium. She was working in policy and advocacy. She was dealing with overfishing, with marine protected areas, with the unsexy, complicated science of saving the planet. Her work took her to Brazil, and this is where the story becomes almost cinematic. Even her experiments with danger looked nothing like the tabloids' idea of a wild royal. In 2012, while some of her cousins were generating headlines in nightclubs, Marina flew to Thailand and spent her summer bruising her shins on a Muay Thai mat. Under strip lighting and ceiling fans, Lady Marina disappeared behind hand wraps and a mouth guard as she learned how to take a hit and keep her balance. It was a very un-Windsor kind of discipline, not parade ground salutes, but controlled aggression, timing, and the humility of being a beginner in someone else's tradition. Imagine the scene: the great-granddaughter of the King of England, living in Rio de Janeiro or exploring the Amazon. In Brazil, the name Windsor carries no weight. The class system of Britain dissolves in the tropical heat. In Brazil, Marina wasn't a lady. She was just a British girl who spoke excellent Portuguese, who loved the ocean, and who was curious about the world. She wrote about her time there with a lyrical intensity. She wrote about the slowing down of time. She wrote about the connection to nature. She was finding a spiritual home that Kensington Palace could never provide. She was stripping away the layers of her inheritance, the succession, the visibility, and the geography. She was performing a kind of royal kenosis, a self-emptying. She was hollowing out the princess to make room for the human being. But as she entered her late 20s, the pressure of her lineage would present one final subtle test. The world of high society is small. The temptation to return to the fold, to use the connections, to take the easy route is always there. And while her sister Amelia was becoming a fixture on the red carpet, Marina was about to make a quiet pivot into a world that sits perfectly at the intersection of her family's history and her own soul, the world of art. But she wouldn't enter it as a patron. She would enter it as a worker. While the rest of the Windsor family was busy navigating the endless PR crises of the 2020s, the memoirs, the Netflix documentaries, the rift between brothers, Lady Marina Windsor was doing something that no royal had done in generations. She was clocking in. She had moved from the Big Give to a new role that perfectly encapsulated her values: the Blue Marine Foundation. From the Big Give, she didn't leap upwards into some glamorous patronage. She moved sideways into the engine room of an environmental charity. Blue Marine Foundation is not a feel-good aquarium with royal patrons on the brochure. It lives in policy briefs, legal fights over marine protected areas, and ugly numbers about overfishing. Marina joined as events manager, which in practice meant spreadsheets full of guest lists and budgets, yes, but also campaigns framed around words like seagrass restoration and marine reserves in the Aeolian Islands. When she talks about it in interviews, she is unnervingly direct. We are in a climate emergency, she says, and this work is urgent because without serious action, there will simply not be a livable planet to pass on to anyone's grandchildren. Coming from a woman whose own bloodline is designed on paper to think in centuries, that kind of language lands differently. Now, it is easy to be cynical here. We are used to royals and charities. We are used to the image of a princess cutting a ribbon at an aquarium, smiling for the cameras, and then leaving in a chauffeur-driven car. That is the patronage model. It is a role of association, not action. Marina's role was different. She wasn't a patron. She was the events manager. This distinction is vital. To be an events manager is to be in the engine room. It means dealing with catering budgets. It means managing guest lists. It means sending emails, coordinating logistics, and standing at the door with a clipboard. It is unglamorous, high-stress, invisible work. At the Blue Marine Foundation, an organization dedicated to restoring the ocean to health by addressing overfishing and creating marine protected areas, Marina found her tribe. She wasn't Lady Marina, the royal cousin. She was a staff member. She traveled to the field. She didn't go to the Caribbean to pose on a yacht. She went to understand the delicate dying ecosystems of the ocean. She immersed herself in the science. She became an advocate not because of who she was, but because of what she knew. This work in the environmental sector highlights the starkest contrast between Marina and the rest of her family. King Charles talks about the environment from the throne. Prince William creates awards for the environment from the palace. Lady Amelia models sustainable clothing on Instagram. Lady Marina works for the environment in an office. She is the only one who has removed the barrier of status between herself and the cause. She is the only one who is not elevating the cause with her presence, but serving it with her labor. As we look at Lady Marina Windsor today in her 30s, living a life of quiet professional fulfillment, we must ask the central historical question: what does she represent? In June 2025, the quiet pattern of her life surfaced for a moment on a phone screen. Marina posted 3 photographs to Instagram with a short caption, "Very happy," and held up her left hand to show a cushion-cut onyx ring set in silver. Standing beside her was Nico Macaulay, a softly bearded cybersecurity account executive whose world is made of clients and software, not sovereigns and state banquets. The choice of date was not random. She announced the engagement on the 8th of June, the anniversary of her grandparents' wedding in York Minster in 1961. It was a small, private way of stitching her own thoroughly ordinary future to the 2 people who had first proved that a royal life could be rewritten from the inside. Nico is not a prince, a billionaire, or the heir to a dukedom. He is in many ways the logical endpoint of Marina's refusal to treat the Windsor name as a career asset. A woman who had already given up a theoretical crown now chose a partner whose life is entirely outside the court, a man who will never open a hospital simply because of his surname. They had been together for 2 years before the press even noticed. By the time the world saw the photographs, the decision that mattered had already been made in the only space Marina has ever really cared about, the invisible, unphotographed interior of her life. For the last century, the minor royal has been a problem to be solved. What do you do with the spare heirs? The old solution was the Duke of Kent model. You give them a uniform, a stipend, and a lifetime of boring duty. The new solution, pioneered by Harry and Meghan, is the celebrity model. You monetize the fame. Marina Windsor represents the option 0, the option of total normalcy. She proves that it is possible to have the blood of kings in your veins and yet live as a private citizen. She proves that the trap of royalty is largely a mental one. Her life argues that the only way to truly survive the gilded cage is not to decorate it, and not to sell tickets to it, but to walk out of it. She has achieved what Prince Harry spent years claiming he wanted: privacy. But she achieved it by doing the one thing Harry could not bring himself to do. She gave up the relevance. She understood the transaction. If you want to be left alone, you must be boring. You must not give the Daily Mail anything to print. You must not wear the tiara. You must not date the rock star. You must not write the book. Marina's silence is her shield. It is a fortress she built brick by saying no to every interview request, no to every modeling offer, and no to every invitation that came with a press pass. Ultimately, Marina's story brings us back to the woman who started it all, her grandmother Catherine, the Duchess of Kent. 3 months after the engagement, the other great thread in Marina's life came to an end. On the 4th of September, 2025, Catherine, Duchess of Kent, Mrs. Kent to the children of Hull, a mama to her 10 grandchildren, died at the age of 92 in the modest Kensington Palace house where she had hidden from public life for 2 decades. Her coffin was carried to Westminster Cathedral, and for the first time in modern British history, a royal funeral was held there, according to Catholic rites. In the long lenses outside the cathedral, one figure kept reappearing: Marina, in black, standing beside her sister and their grandfather. She no longer had a number in the line of succession. She was no longer needed on any balcony, but at the first Catholic royal funeral in centuries, she was exactly where history had been pushing her to stand since the day she chose the old faith. After the Mass, as the Duchess was taken to be buried at Frogmore among the exiled and the abdicated, Marina went back to the one place where she still allows herself to be visibly emotional, her Instagram account. There she posted old photographs and a long, unguarded message to my beloved Amama, thanking her for music, kindness, and the stubborn example of a faith lived on its own terms. It read less like a royal statement than like a private letter that had slipped into the public record. For anyone paying attention, it also made something else obvious. The hidden life Marina chose as a teenager is not an escape from history. It is the way she has decided to carry her part of it forward, not the torch of the royal family. Her brother Edward or her cousin William will hold that. In a world that is screaming for attention, Marina's choice to be a nobody is a radical act of dignity. There is a concept in the Catholic faith called the hidden life. It refers to the years Jesus spent in Nazareth before his public ministry, the years of working as a carpenter, living a normal, anonymous life. It is considered a holy state. It is a validation of the ordinary. Marina Windsor has chosen the hidden life. History will likely forget Lady Marina Windsor. She will not be a character in the future seasons of The Crown. She will not have biographers picking through her letters. She will not have a statue. Her name will be a footnote in the genealogy books, a small print entry, B. 1992, forfeited succession 2008. For a celebrity, this erasure would be a tragedy. For a politician, it would be a failure. But for Marina, one suspects this is the ultimate victory. She is the girl who looked at the machine that had crushed her grandfather's personality, isolated her grandmother, and trapped her cousins, and she simply stepped aside. She is the unroyal, the silent Windsor. She traded a theoretical place on a throne she would never sit on for a real place in a world she could actually touch. She traded the power of a name for the peace of a soul. And in the end, as the flashbulbs pop for Amelia, and the state trumpets sound for William, and the headlines scream for Harry, Marina Windsor is likely sitting in a quiet office, or walking in a park, or kneeling in a pew, enjoying the one thing her family has fought wars, signed treaties, and abdicated crowns to find, but rarely ever kept to eat 'em.